They say every great tale begins with a battle. But tonight's story? It begins with a man arguing with a goat over a blanket. Welcome, traveler. If you're here, chances are, it's late. Maybe you're in bed, the room is quiet, but your mind isn't. Maybe you're just like Theobald, a simple soldier who ended up in the middle of a holy war without meaning to. This isn't the story of a hero. No kings. No prophecies. Just dusty boots, stolen bread, awkward romance, and a man who somehow ends up guarding relics he doesn't believe in, while secretly writing poetry about a girl who once laughed at his nose. So if that sounds like something worth staying for, take a breath. Tap like. Maybe subscribe, if you haven't yet. And hey, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because if you're still awake, you're not alone. Now, back to Theobald. The night before the march, he couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because his bunkmate brought beans to dinner. And in a stone barracks, that's practically an act of war. The first thing you notice in a soldier's life isn't the sword. It's the smell. Boiled linen, stale bread, someone else's sweat in your cloak, it hits you harder than any sermon. They never show that part in the tapestries. No nobleman ever looked heroic with mold on his boots. I woke before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because Bertrand, my bunkmate, snored like a dying mule being baptized. He'd rolled onto my blanket in the night and mumbled something about figures I didn't ask. The barracks were quiet, but not peaceful. Quiet in that buzzing way a room gets when it's full of men who are all pretending to sleep. No one wanted to admit they were awake. If you admitted that, it meant you were thinking about what came next. I sat up, ran my hand through hair that had gone from blonde to dust brown, and stared at my pack. It was small. One shirt. One small cross I never wore. Dried meat that had fused into one terrifying clump. And a letter to Isabel, still folded. It wasn't a letter she'd ever read. I never even sealed it. But writing it made the days easier. Sometimes I'd pretend she was reading it aloud, pausing to laugh at the things I said, or correcting my Latin as if I ever knew any. Across from me, young Alan was praying again. He prayed like someone trying to stay awake. Loud, confident, desperate. He joined because his brother died in a skirmish near Anch. Said he came to honor his bloodline. Mostly, he just complained about the bread. Bertrand farted in his sleep. Someone muttered, "God help us," and the room exhaled together. This, apparently, was the army of the Lord. By sunrise, the sergeant's bell clanged against the iron pole outside. One of the few luxuries we had, a man whose entire job was to bang a bell when it was time to pretend we had a plan. We lined up. Rough rows of rougher men. Some wore armor polished to shine. Others, like me, wore a stitched leather vest that might have once been a stillbag. One man showed up still tying his trousers. "Today," barked the sergeant, "we prepare to march. Tomorrow, we ride. And may your feet blister with grace." Bertrand whispered, "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." I bit my lip to keep from laughing. You had to, really. If you stopped laughing, you'd start thinking. Because thinking led to asking questions. And questions led to fear. And fear, well, fear led to hugging goats for warmth. Long story. We were told the plan was simple: ride east with a supply train, make camp by the old Roman aqueduct, await the bishop's envoy, and then receive final blessings before heading into whatever divine madness lay ahead. Simple plans always meant complicated deaths. I spent the morning oiling my boots and pretending I understood our map. Alan kept trying to identify clouds that looked like saints. Bertrand, ever the romantic, was carving a poem into the handle of his dagger. Something about a girl named Brigitte who had 3 teeth and could outdrink a priest. And me? I just kept glancing at the road beyond the barracks wall. I'd dreamed of that road as a boy, back when adventure meant dragons, not diarrhea. At lunch, a monk came by with a bucket of something that might once have been stew. I nodded politely, took a bowl, and immediately regretted it. There were things floating in it. One of them had eyes. But still, we sat together in the courtyard, the sun warming the stones, sharing bites, swatting flies, and listening to birds that sang as if the world weren't about to go mad again. There was comfort in that, in the sameness of it. In the quiet clink of spoons on tin. In Bertrand humming a tune no one recognized. Later, I wandered alone past the stables. The horses were restless. They always knew when something was coming. A boy no older than 12 was brushing a gray mare, his hands sure, his face blank. "You nervous?" I asked him. He didn't look up. "Horses don't like nervous people." That was his answer. Not yes. Not no. Just that. And he was right. As the sun lowered, the air turned still. Too still. Like the breath before a storm. Back in the barracks, we were issued fresh bandages and told to write to your loved ones, just in case. Alain wrote 6 pages to his mother. Bertrand started a letter to Brigitte but fell asleep on it. I took out my letter to Isabelle. Looked at it. Folded it again. Put it away. And then I climbed up to the roof. The stars were beginning to blink into the night. I sat on the edge, feet dangling above the courtyard, the stone warm against my palms. From up here, the camp looked smaller. The men looked less like warriors and more like boys with too much armor. The war drums hadn't started yet. There was still silence to be found, if you climbed high enough. Tomorrow, we ride. But tonight, I would sit here just a little longer. With the stars. With the wind. With the quiet ache of waiting. Because even in a world that worships noise, there is something sacred about stillness. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't ready to lose that yet. The bishop arrived in the afternoon. He came not on a mighty stallion, but in a cart pulled by 2 tired donkeys, his robes flapping in the wind like someone had hung laundry on a moving wagon. He was pale, his face thin and unreadable, the sort of man who looked like he hadn't enjoyed a single moment of his life, and wasn't planning to start today. We lined up again, because apparently that's what armies do best. The bishop said a few holy words, most of which I didn't catch because Bertrand leaned over and whispered, "He looks like a turnip that learned Latin." I snorted. Alain glared at us. "This is sacred," he whispered, scandalized. "Right?" Bertrand muttered. "So was the stew yesterday, and look how that turned out." The bishop blessed our weapons. Dipped a twig in water and flicked it at us like we were rowdy sheep. My dagger got wet. I'm not sure it felt holier. Still smelled like onions. After the ceremony, he summoned the youngest of us, which, somehow, was me, and asked me to carry his bag to the chapel tent. It was heavier than it looked. Full of scrolls, coins, and something wrapped in velvet that I didn't dare peek at. "I heard you can write," the bishop said, as I struggled behind him. "I scribble," I replied. "Same thing, at war," he said, flat. He didn't smile. I wasn't sure if he knew how. Inside the chapel tent, he sat me down with a quill and began dictating a letter. I wrote slowly, careful not to smear the ink. His Latin was impeccable, his tone cold, and halfway through, I realized the letter wasn't about faith. It was about supplies. Missing carts. Salted meat gone mysteriously missing. It was a complaint, sent not to Rome, but to a merchant family in Genoa. The church, it seemed, did not ride alone. When we finished, he looked at me, sharp and calculating. "You're not here for faith, are you?" "No, Father." "What then?" I thought about Isabelle. About the way her braid swung when she walked. About how she once said, "Theobald, you think too much." "Land," I said. He nodded, unsurprised. "That's honest. The Lord likes honest men. Even if he rarely rewards them." Then he handed me a slice of dried fig and waved me off. That evening, Bertrand and I sat under the awning of the stable, sharpening blades and pretending we were warriors. A stable boy passed by holding a chicken upside down, humming a tavern tune. The chicken didn't seem pleased. Alain joined us, still reading from a book of Psalms. Every so often he'd pause to say something like, "War is the trial by fire." Bertrand leaned over to me. "Fire would be fine. It's the lice I'm worried about." As the sun dipped behind the hills, the captain gathered us for a final briefing. "Tomorrow, we ride for the hills near Tiberias," he said, pointing to a map no one could actually read. "There's a Roman fort, or what's left of one. We make camp there, then wait." "Wait for what?" someone asked. "Orders," the captain said. "From who?" He paused. "From someone holier than me." There was a silence. Then Bertrand said, "So, the bishop's sandals, then." No one laughed. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it was probably true. That night, I couldn't sleep. Again. I went to the edge of camp, past the tents, to where the ground dipped toward a dried-out riverbed. The stars were clearer here, the wind colder. I sat on a rock and took out the letter to Isabel. Still not sealed. I added a line. "Today I met a bishop who believes in God and salt. He asked if I was here for faith. I told him no. I don't know if that made me honest or just sad." Then I put the letter away and stayed there, breathing with the wind. Back at camp, Bertrand had stolen someone's blanket. Alain was still whispering scripture in his sleep. Somewhere, a donkey brayed like it had seen the face of the devil. And me? I just stared at the stars and wondered if anyone else, somewhere out there, was doing the same, hoping for a miracle that didn't feel like one when it arrived. The road to Tiberias was less a road and more a suggestion. Rocks, dust, and what might have once been Roman paving stones poked out like broken teeth. Our horses hated it. Bertrand hated it more. He claimed the saddle had been designed by a man who'd never met a spine. Still, we rode. 40 men and a cart full of things we couldn't name, moving eastward like a procession of uncertain pilgrims, too loud for stealth, too ragged for pride. The sun bore down like it had a personal grudge. Alain tried to sing a hymn to keep the pace. He only got through 2 verses before a bee flew into his mouth. We all took it as a sign to march in silence. By midday, our lips were dry and our tempers shorter than Bertrand's sword, which was mostly decorative and slightly bent from a tavern incident he refused to discuss. At a bend in the trail, we passed a goat's skull mounted on a stick. Bertrand stared at it. "That a warning?" he asked. Alain crossed himself. "It's pagan. Or worse, Saracen sorcery." "I think it's just a goat," I said. "Still creepy," Bertrand mumbled, and nudged his horse slightly left. When we reached the ruins near Tiberias, we expected something dramatic: crumbled towers, sacred ground, maybe a ghost or two. Instead, we found a few stones, half a wall, and a very fat lizard sunbathing where Rome once stood. The captain declared it adequate. We set up camp anyway. The fort had one intact corner, which became the army, mess tent, chapel, and latrine, depending on who asked and when. The rest of us pitched tents on the uneven slope, cursing every rock under our backs. Bertrand tried to flirt with a merchant's daughter who'd come with the supply train. "How long you staying?" he asked, smiling. She didn't answer. Just handed him a loaf of bread and left. "Progress," he said proudly. At dusk, we lit a small fire. Someone roasted something they swore was rabbit, though I suspect it once meowed. I sat a little apart, sharpening my blade for the 3rd time that week. Not because it needed it, but because it felt like doing something useful. A local guide joined us, thin, sunburnt, wrapped in linen from head to foot. He claimed to know the hills, the water routes, the hidden paths. His name was Elias, and he spoke perfect French with an accent like warm sand. He told stories while chewing dates, of wells that whispered at night, of ruins swallowed by vines, of jackals that laughed like men. Bertrand listened, wide-eyed. "You ever see one of those jackals?" he asked. "Yes," Elias said. "They were arguing over a figure. Like, talking." "No. But very loudly." That was enough for Bertrand. Elias pointed to the hills. "That ridge, many died there last spring. 2 banners still hang on thorn trees. No one touches them. Not even birds. We fell quiet. For once, even Alan had no psalm to offer. Later that night, I walked the edge of camp. The sky was full of stars again. Same sky, different ground. That struck me, somehow, how the heavens never changed, even when everything below them did. I sat on the low wall of the ruined fort and unrolled Isabel's letter. Wrote, "We march today. Bertrand's horse is slowly winning their war. We passed a goat skull and called it a sign. I think we all need signs now, just to feel like someone's watching." Then I paused. Looked at the ink. The stars. The ruined stones. And I wrote, "I don't know if I believe in what we're doing. But I believe in the way the stars show up no matter where I go. I believe in Bertrand's terrible jokes. I believe in this letter, even if you never read it." Then I folded it, tucked it back, and breathed deep. From the other side of camp, someone snored. Probably Alan. The fire crackled low. The hills waited, quiet and ancient. And somewhere far away, a lizard reclaimed the ruins of Rome. It rained the next morning. Not the dramatic kind, not a storm to cleanse sins or flood the wicked. Just a drizzling, persistent mist that soaked everything without being asked. My blanket smelled like old socks. Bertrand claimed his had grown moss. We were told to stay camped until further orders. Soon, the captain said. That word again. Soon was the most dangerous word in any army. It meant nobody really knew anything. The ruins became a village of waiting. Alan prayed louder. Bertrand napped harder. I watched the sky and counted ants that lived beneath my bedroll. One of them had a limp. Supplies ran low by day 3. Our bread ration had the consistency of roof tile and tasted slightly of sandal. Bertrand tried to trade his for dried figs from Elias, but the guide just stared at him and said, "I like my teeth." Still, we made do. Bertrand began digging a hole behind the ruins. For what, he wouldn't say. Somewhere to think, he explained. Too many people here are thinking out loud. Isn't that what you're doing? I asked. He looked at me. Exactly. I helped him dig. Not because I believed in the hole, but because it was something to do. On the 4th evening, while poking at a suspicious stew, Alan stood suddenly and shouted, "Bones!" Naturally, everyone froze. Then Bertrand whispered, "If that's stew-related, I'm going to cry." But Alan pointed to the base of the ruined wall. Real bones. Half-buried. Ancient, worn smooth, curled like someone had died trying to sleep. The captain ordered the site cleared. By dusk, they'd uncovered several skeletons. No weapons. No armor. Just robes and dust. Elias inspected them and said quietly, "These were monks. Long ago. Perhaps hiding." Hiding from what? Bertrand asked. Elias just looked toward the hills. From men who also thought they were holy. We buried the bones properly the next day. Alan read verses with more reverence than usual. Bertrand took off his helmet. Even the wind seemed quieter. I wrote to Isabel that night. We found bones today. Old ones. They didn't die in battle. Just, quietly. I think that scared me more. To vanish, not as a martyr or a legend, but as a forgotten shadow under a wall. The next morning, a runner arrived. Breathless. Mud-covered. New orders. We would ride at dawn. No one cheered. Just packed. Slowly. Quietly. Like men who'd been reminded that the road was no longer a story, it was real, and it waited. Bertrand filled his hole with a flat rock and scratched something into it with a stick. "What does it say?" I asked. He shrugged. Probably something wise. I looked closer. It read, "Bertrand's thinking hole. Please knock." Alan rolled his eyes. But I smiled. Because humor was armor, too. We woke before dawn. The kind of darkness that feels thicker than night, when the stars are gone but the sun hasn't yet admitted it's coming. The fire was out. The bread was colder. Even the silence felt tired. We packed. Saddled the horses. Folded the tents like monks folding sins. No one spoke much, not even Bertrand, which was how I knew something felt off. As we formed up, the captain raised a hand. "We ride north," he said, voice low. "Through the ravine. Keep alert." The ravine, we'd heard, was narrow and quiet, too quiet. Rumors said patrols had gone missing there. Bandits, maybe. Or worse. Nobody said what worse was. They just left it there, like a rock in your boot. Still, we rode. Single file, hooves crunching over dry gravel, torches flickering in the early light. The walls of the ravine rose on either side like closing jaws. The air smelled like old dust and nervous sweat. Bertrand leaned toward me. "If I die," he whispered, "tell Brigitte she still owes me a kiss." "I thought she bit you." "She did. That counts." We rode in silence after that. Then came the stop. Not the sudden, dramatic kind, just that strange ripple through the line when someone up front slows, and no one knows why. Words spread backward in slow whispers, blocked path. Bertrand dismounted to stretch his back. "Maybe it's a sign," he said. Alain crossed himself. "Every delay is a test." "No," Bertrand said, pointing to his boots. "Every delay is a blister." Eventually, we walked forward to see for ourselves. A rock slide. Fresh. Still shifting slightly. The road ahead was covered. No passage, not without losing a horse or three. The captain cursed softly. "Back," he ordered. "Back and around." So we turned. 40 horses. 2 carts. 1 bishop's banner. And a guide who clearly regretted taking this job. By the time we returned to the camp, or what was left of it, the sun was high, and our patience low. The ruins greeted us like an old joke. "Home again," Bertrand muttered. "Even the lizard's still here." Sure enough, the fat lizard from before was back on its rock, sunning itself like nothing had happened. The captain said we'd rest one more night. "Better than getting crushed," he added, not entirely convincingly. That evening, spirits were strange. Some soldiers laughed too loudly. Others said nothing at all. Alain read psalms with a forced urgency. Elias polished his knife for no reason anyone could determine. I sat on the broken wall again, letter in hand, thinking. I wrote, "We marched today." Then we didn't. The road was blocked, like the world forgot to finish writing this part. Bertrand says it's fate. Alain says it's a test. I think it's just rocks. But it made me wonder, do stories only count when they move forward? Or is there something sacred in the parts that stall? Later, Bertrand brought me half a plum and declared it a feast. "We may not ride far," he said, chewing loudly, "but we eat like kings. Rotten, confused kings." I laughed. And when night fell, I didn't go to the wall. I sat by the fire with them instead. Bertrand, Alain, Elias, sharing crumbs and old stories. No battles. No glory. Just the way Alain once got kicked by a mule during Mass, and how Bertrand once serenaded a window that turned out to be a beehive. The fire crackled. The stars blinked. And for a moment, we weren't crusaders or sinners or lost men on a blocked road. We were just people, trying. And somehow, that felt holy, too. Some days, nothing happens. No battles. No miracles. Just existence. This was one of those days. We didn't march. We didn't train. We didn't even argue much, which was almost alarming. The captain had left early in the morning with Elias to scout for another route, leaving behind a vague command to not burn anything in his absence. Bertrand immediately took that as permission to sleep until noon. Alain disagreed, naturally, and tried to organize a group prayer. No one joined. By midday, he was praying solo near the lizard. I spent the morning mending my cloak. One corner had torn, probably from the saddle or the unfortunate time I tripped over Bertrand's digging stick. It was slow, clumsy work. I was not born for needle and thread. But something about the rhythm felt calming. Honest. Sometimes, surviving a war meant fixing things no one else would notice. After lunch, stale dates and something Bertrand called cheese, but smelled like regret, I wandered to the edge of camp. Sat under the shade of a crooked tree and watched ants move a crumb bigger than any of them. It made me think of our entire mission. Then it made me hungry again. The sky was cloudless, but the wind whispered like it wanted rain. A banner flapped half-heartedly near the ruined gate. Horses swatted flies with their tails. A fly landed on my nose. I let it. It seemed to be having a harder day than me. Around mid-afternoon, Alan approached, carrying his book and looking like he wanted to talk. "Have you considered that perhaps we were meant to wait?" he asked. "I think we've been waiting since we arrived," I said. "No, I mean, spiritually. Perhaps the stillness is divine." I looked at him. Bertrand snored loudly nearby. "A lot of divine stillness," I said. Alan frowned, but sat beside me anyway. We watched two birds chase each other in lazy circles above the camp. One of them dropped something mid-flight. It landed with a soft thud beside Bertrand. He didn't wake. We both stared at it. "A sign?" I asked. Alan looked up, as if checking for angelic confirmation. "Maybe." It was half a fig. Later that day, a small group of local farmers passed by the ruins. They were herding goats. One old man waved at us without fear. A young girl pointed at Bertrand, who had one boot off and a sock over his face. She giggled. I waved back. They moved on. Elias and the captain returned just before dusk, both dusty and annoyed. Apparently, the northern route was too steep for carts, and the eastern path belonged to someone. When Bertrand asked who, the captain just said, "Someone with sharper arrows than us." So we stayed. Again. That night, by the fire, the mood turned odd. Not sad, not exactly. Just stretched thin, like we were all waiting for a page to turn that refused to turn. Bertrand poked the fire with a stick. "You ever think this whole Crusade thing is just life, but with fewer chairs?" Alan blinked. "That makes no sense." "I mean," Bertrand said, "we eat, sleep, wait, and sometimes someone yells at us. Sounds like my mother's house." We laughed. Even Alan smiled. I wrote in my letter. We stayed today. Again. I watched ants. I mended my cloak. Bertrand compared war to household furniture. I think I agree with him more than I should. Nothing happened. But I felt peaceful. Or maybe just tired enough to confuse the two. Then I added, "If you were here, Isabel, I think you'd hate it. Too many flies. But maybe you'd like the stillness. The quiet kind. The kind where you're allowed to breathe." The fire crackled. Stars came back. And I leaned back on my rolled cloak, eyes half closed, listening to Bertrand hum something tuneless beside me. Somewhere in the ruins, the fat lizard claimed its rock again. And above all of us, the sky stayed the same, unchanging, unworried, and infinitely patient. On the seventh day, the bishop asked if anyone knew how to play chess. No one volunteered. Naturally, Bertrand raised his hand. "I once played with a man who cheated with 3 bishops," he said proudly. The bishop narrowed his eyes. "That's not how chess works." "Exactly. That's why I lost." And just like that, the bishop made him his opponent. They set up a board on a crate between 2 wine barrels under the shade of a fraying tent. The pieces were uneven, carved from bone and wood, some of them missing heads. Bertrand kept calling the pawns peasants and insisted they be given proper names. "This one's Gilles," he said. "He's in love with a bishop's daughter." The bishop didn't laugh. He just moved his knight. Word spread quickly. We were watching holy war on a smaller scale. Half the camp gathered around, offering advice, commentary, or poorly timed snacks. Alan insisted the game was symbolic. Bertrand insisted the bishop was hiding extra pieces in his sleeves. He wasn't. By midday, the match was still going. Bertrand had sacrificed both rooks for emotional reasons. The bishop barely blinked. "This is a trap," Bertrand whispered to me as he squinted at the board. "He wants me to think he's winning, which means I'm actually winning." "You've lost half your army," I said. "Exactly. Now I'm unpredictable." The bishop's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. By sunset, Bertrand lost. Gracefully, by his standards. He stood, bowed, and declared, "May the Lord bless your chessboard and may all your pawns find love." The bishop just nodded, then packed the pieces into a leather pouch and disappeared into his tent. We applauded anyway. Later that evening, the captain returned from another failed scouting attempt and sighed loud enough to wake birds. "The road is still blocked," he muttered. Bertrand leaned toward me. "That includes metaphorical roads, yes." The captain, clearly not in a poetic mood, ignored him. So we stayed. Again. After dinner, flatbread and something green, I wandered to the edge of the ruins. The night air was cool, clean. I sat under the crooked tree, same as before, and listened to the faint sounds of boots, breathing, and Bertrand trying to write a love poem to a pawn named Gilles. I opened the letter again. Wrote. Today the bishop played chess. Bertrand lost in a blaze of confusing glory. It was oddly comforting, the way men can argue over rules and strategy even in a place meant for blood. I think it reminded me that humans, despite everything, still love stories. Even if they are told with carved pieces on a splintered crate. The stars blinked overhead. Alon walked past, reading to himself, still wearing the same dusty boots he claimed were blessed by endurance. Elias sat quietly nearby, sharpening a stick that may or may not be a weapon. I didn't ask. The fire crackled lower than usual. No songs. No sermons. Just the breath of a camp caught between waiting and not knowing. Bertrand eventually joined me under the tree. I think I nearly won, he said. I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. In spirit, anyway. I handed him a crust of bread. He took it like it was gold. And together, in the hush between one stalled chapter and whatever came next, we simply Saturday. Sometimes, that was enough. It was just before dawn when the thunder came. Not the crashing kind, not yet. Just a low, distant rumble that felt like a giant shifting in its sleep. The kind of sound that made the horses fidget and the men look up without knowing why. I was already awake. Couldn't sleep. Again. Bertrand had somehow taken the entire blanket and was curled up like a suspiciously large pastry. Alon murmured scripture in his dreams. Elias was sharpening the same stick he'd sharpened for 3 days. It didn't seem sharper. The sky looked strange, tinged with red and purple in a way that made the ruins feel older than usual. Sacred, even. Or haunted. Depending on your mood. By breakfast, the thunder had crept closer. The captain gathered us near the wall. His hair was damp, and his eyes were tired. There's a storm coming, he said, as if we didn't know. Alon looked hopeful. A cleansing rain. Bertrand muttered, cleansing my boots, maybe. We secured the tents. Reinforced the walls with whatever we had, crates, shields, one broken lute. Bertrand tried to use his digging stick. The captain confiscated it. By mid-morning, the wind had teeth. Flags snapped violently. Dust flew in spirals. Horses kicked their stalls. The bishop stood alone near the edge of camp, his robes snapping like angry parchment. He looked up at the sky as if daring it to make a theological mistake. The first drops hit hard. Cold and full of spite. Then came the rain. The real kind, loud, hard, endless. Buckets from heaven. Boots filled. Tents collapsed. Alon stood in the middle of it all, arms wide, soaking wet, shouting psalms into the storm. No one stopped him. Bertrand tried to build a trench. It became a bathtub. I stood under what was left of our awning, arms wrapped in my cloak, watching the sky unravel. It was strange. We'd seen nothing but stillness for days. Silence, dust, boredom. And now the world was shouting. Every tree bowed. Every stone trembled. Every man, holy or not, was humbled. And yet, I felt calm. Maybe because there was nothing to do but endure it. Maybe because the rain made everyone honest. No hiding, no posing. Just people. Wet, tired people. After what felt like hours, the storm passed. Not suddenly, storms never leave with grace. But the thunder faded, the rain softened, and the sky turned from war to apology. We emerged like survivors from a shipwreck. Soggy. Silent. Slightly cleaner. Bertrand looked at me and said, "I've changed my mind about nature." Alon smiled, soaked but glowing. "The Lord sends what we need." "The Lord sent me pneumonia," Bertrand muttered. We rebuilt slowly. Hung our cloaks to dry. Rediscovered our gear. One soldier found his helmet 3 fields away. That night, the stars returned. And the camp felt different. Lighter. Not because the storm had passed, but because we had stood through it. Together. Without fighting, without running. Just standing. And sometimes, that's harder than any battle. I sat by the fire with the others. Bertrand was carving a tiny bishop piece from a bit of bone. Alon wrote notes in the back of his psalm book. Elias, as always, watched the fire like it owed him something. And I wrote one last line to Isabel. Tonight, the sky finally spoke. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a sign. Just thunder, wind, and water. But somehow, I think I understood it. Then I folded the letter. Not to send it. Not even to finish it. Just to hold it, one more time. The wind had stopped. The fire crackled. And somewhere in the darkness, the lizard probably found a dry rock. They called it Mud Spire. No one knew why. There were no spires. Just mud. An entire camp dropped in the middle of a shallow valley that hadn't decided if it wanted to be a swamp or a grave. We arrived at sunset, boots squelching, spirits low. The captain dismounted, looked around for half a minute, then muttered something I assume was a prayer. Either that or a threat to whoever picked this site. Bertrand sniffed the air and gagged. Alon, ever the optimist, said, "Perhaps the Lord has brought us here to test us." Bertrand pointed at a nearby puddle that burped. "I think the test already failed." The tents were older than we were. Half were missing ropes. The others had ropes but no canvas. Ours came with a frog inside. We named him Gregory. The ground sank slightly under every step. Alon claimed it was soft with humility. I said it was damp with regret. We set up our area as best we could. One tent, one pile of things we hoped were not food, and a tiny fire that hissed at us like it didn't want to exist. Elias didn't speak the whole time, just kept stabbing the ground with a stick to see how deep it went. The answer, too deep. By morning, our boots were no longer separate objects. They had become part of the earth. Bertrand claimed his were spiritually fused. Food was delivered late, a cart pulled by a mule that looked actively embarrassed to be here. The driver handed us a sack that smelled like fermented turnips and wished us luck. Breakfast, damp bread, a questionable onion, and a jar labeled fish essence. We decided to fast. The bishop arrived mid-morning. His robes were cleaner than everyone's, which made us suspect sorcery. He looked at the camp once, sighed through his nose, and returned to his own elevated tent, a dry patch propped up between 2 crates and the mercy of a low. We weren't so lucky. A crow landed near our tent, stared directly at me for 10 full seconds, and then flew away. I considered it an omen. Bertrand considered it judgment. That evening, we tried to dig a latrine. By we, I mean Bertrand started, then handed me the stick and wandered off muttering something about artistic boundaries. Elias eventually took over. The hole collapsed twice. By nightfall, we were damp, itchy, and praying for a minor plague just for variety. I sat outside, legs half buried in mud, writing. This place is worse than the last. I didn't think that was possible. Bertrand claims he saw a leech blink at him. Alon says we should sing. Elias is sharpening a stick again. I miss the lizard. Later, Bertrand joined me, holding a pot of something unidentifiable. What's that? I asked. Hope, he said. I sniffed it. Hope has gone bad. We laughed anyway. Because honestly, that's all there was to do. Somewhere behind us, Alon led 3 others in a hymn. It was out of tune. The frogs joined in. Loudly. Elias whittled something by torchlight. Might have been a spoon. Might have been a message to the beyond. The fire cracked once, reluctantly. The stars didn't show. Even they didn't want to look. But in that miserable, muddy, mosquito-buzzing mess, we stayed. Not because we were brave. Not because we were devout. But because there was nowhere else to go. And somehow, just staying, surviving another day in a place that tried its best to forget us, felt like defiance. Like a very soggy kind of victory. It began with cheese. Specifically, a round, greenish will of goat cheese that no one claimed but everyone wanted. It appeared one morning on a crate near the cook tent, glowing faintly in the damp sunlight like a relic or a trap. Bertrand saw it first. He approached slowly, like one might approach a sleeping bear. Don't move, he whispered. It can sense fear. Alon appeared beside him, arms crossed. That's ration supply. You can't just take it. Says who? Says order. Structure. Logic. Bertrand raised an eyebrow. Logic mold that color. I watched from a distance as more soldiers gathered, circling the cheese with the reverence of villagers around a miracle or a cursed well. Someone suggested sharing it. Someone else suggested burning it. One man tried to lick it. He was stopped. The captain arrived and demanded to know what the fuss was about. Bertrand pointed. An authorized dairy, sir. The captain stared. He paused for a long time. Then, against all expectation, he said, we settle this with a duel. Not a real duel, of course. A mock one. With sticks. Supervised. First to fall in the mud loses. Winner gets the cheese. Loser gets to walk around saying they almost had it. Somehow, this became an event. By noon, half the camp was watching. Someone even built a crude wooden ring with rope and optimism. The bishop stood off to the side with crossed arms, pretending not to be amused. Bertrand entered the ring shirtless, for reasons unknown. His opponent was a wiry man named Thomas, known for winning an argument with a horse once. Theobald, that's me, was appointed referee. I had no whistle, so I used a spoon. The match began with a lot of circling and yelling. Bertrand's style was chaotic, wide swings, bad footwork, excellent facial expressions. Thomas moved like a man whose entire childhood had been dodging bread thrown by siblings. The crowd cheered. Then Bertrand slipped. A glorious, muddy, theatrical fall, arms flailing, stick flying, face first into what could only be described as future soup. The match was over. Thomas raised his stick. Bertrand raised his thumb. The bishop clapped. Once. Later, the cheese was sliced, sniffed, regretted, and eaten anyway. I had a bite. It tasted like old decisions. But that day, we laughed. Not just chuckles. Real, full-body laughter. The kind that echoes and softens hard edges. The kind that reminds you you're still human, even when the ground is mud and the sky forgets to care. That night, I wrote. Today we fought for cheese. It was stupid. It was perfect. We forgot, for a while, that we were stuck in a swamp. That the road was gone. That nothing was certain. I think sometimes the soul needs absurdity the way the body needs bread. Bertrand came by, face still crusted with mud, and handed me a piece of what remained. For your bravery, he said solemnly. I didn't do anything. Exactly. The rarest courage. We sat by the fire again. The mud, the frogs, the gnats, all still there. But something in the camp had changed. People lingered outside their tents a little longer. The laughter stayed in the air, like incense. Alan even hummed while cleaning his boots. Elias didn't say anything, but he carved a small wedge of cheese into the side of his walking stick. And me? I watched the stars reappear, faint, reluctant, but real. In Mudspire, even a bad sky was still something to be grateful for. 3 days after the cheese duel, someone found a map. It was wedged between 2 crates near the quartermaster's tent, rolled tight and tied with twine. Nobody claimed it. No seal. No name. Just a map, sitting there like a whisper that wanted to start a rumor. Naturally, we opened it. Theobald, me, Bertrand, Alan, and Elias gathered around our makeshift table, a flat shield on 2 barrels, and stared at the faded lines. The river was wrong. The hills were in the wrong place. And there, in spidery ink, Torre des Cendres, a tower none of us had heard of, marked with a circle and a tiny drawing of fire. Bertrand squinted. Cendres. That means ashes, right? Roughly, I said. So, Tower of Ashes. Alan crossed himself. That's definitely cursed, Bertrand grinned. We should go immediately. I expected the others to laugh. Instead, Elias just nodded once. By noon, the 4 of us had convinced the captain to let us scout. His exact words were, "Fine. Just don't come back with fewer limbs." We packed light, bread, cloaks, Bertrand's lucky spoon, and the map that clearly hadn't seen daylight in years. The journey began like all bad ideas, optimistically. The road north was overgrown, narrow, and watched by crows with judgmental faces. We followed the crude lines on the parchment, measuring landmarks by guesswork and Bertrand's imagination. That boulder looks like a goat, he said. It looks like a rock, Alan said. Goats are rocks with opinions. It took hours to reach the rise the map called Widow's Back. It wasn't a ridge. It was a swamp. A loud, squishy, gnat-filled swamp. My back doesn't feel blessed, Bertrand muttered, swatting insects. By late afternoon, we spotted something in the distance, a narrow, leaning tower of stone rising from a shallow hill. Cracked, lopsided, with ivy climbing its sides like it wanted to pull it down. No smoke. No flame. No ashes. But it was there. The Tower of Ashes. We approached slowly. The door had no lock. Just rotted wood and a faded mark, something between a sun and a wheel. Alan whispered a prayer. Elias drew his knife. Bertrand knocked. There was no answer. Just wind. Inside, the air was dry. Dust, cobwebs, a staircase that wound up into shadows. We climbed, slowly, carefully. Every step creaked like a warning. At the top, we found books. Dozens of them. Piled on shelves, some collapsed, some intact. Not scripture. Not war logs. Just stories. Fables. Poems. Maps of imagined places. One had illustrations of birds wearing tiny shoes. Bertrand sat on a crate and picked up a volume titled The Fox Who Laughed at Kings. He laughed so hard he nearly fell off. Alan looked offended. This is a waste of parchment. Elias said nothing, but read silently, eyes narrow and still. I picked up a book that had my name on the first page. Just Theobald. Not a common name. Not in these parts. I opened it. Inside, blank pages. All of them. But the last one? Write what you remember. Before it becomes legend. I didn't know what it meant. Still don't. But I sat down and pulled out a piece of charcoal from my bag. Bertrand passed me a slice of dried plum. I like this place, he said. Smells like paper and secrets. We spent hours there. Reading. Sitting. Not speaking much. At dusk, we left the tower and marked it on our own map. The real one. The one that made sense to no one but us. The map that lied had led us here. But maybe not all lies are bad. Some lies show you where you need to be, Not where you expect to go. That night, back at Mudspire, I wrote. Today we followed a false map to a ruined tower full of forgotten stories. I found a book that asked me to remember. I think I will. Because when you're stuck in mud and war, sometimes the strangest paths are the ones that remind you you're still human. Then I folded the map. The lying one. And kept it. Because sometimes the road that doesn't exist still takes you somewhere. We returned to Mudspire under stars. No fanfare. No cheers. Just 4 tired men, 2.5 usable boots, and a map that still didn't make sense. Bertrand was humming. Alon had gone quiet. Elias kept glancing over his shoulder, like the tower might follow us home. We'd left the books behind. Not because they weren't worth keeping, but because somehow it felt wrong to take them. The tower wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. Watching. Not haunted, exactly. But not empty either. Still, we brought things back. Bertrand had a bookmark shaped like a duck. Alon had a scroll he claimed was heretical nonsense but hadn't stopped rereading. Elias brought nothing visible, but sharpened his knife with more purpose than usual. Me? I brought the blank book. The one with my name on it. I didn't mention that part. Mudspire hadn't changed. Still damp. Still buzzing with frogs and failure. The bishop nodded at us from his perch like a tired owl. The captain asked what we'd found. We told him, a ruin, nothing of value. He grunted. That's better than trouble. That night, Bertrand insisted on making soup. It tasted like root vegetables and accidental leather. We sat around the fire, our small circle flickering in the wet dark, each of us a little quieter than usual. Not samba. Just, full. Of what? I'm not sure. The silence between us felt earned. Eventually, Alan asked, do you think stories rot? No one answered for a while. Then Bertrand said, only the boring ones. I smiled. Then I opened the blank book. I tore a piece from the back and began to write. Not about the tower. Not yet. But about Bertrand's duel. About the cheese. About the lizard. About Mudspire. Because maybe, someday, someone would find this. And maybe they'd laugh. Or maybe they'd feel less alone. And maybe that's reason enough. The next morning, a courier arrived. He bore orders, real ones, sealed and signed. We were to break camp. Not today, not tomorrow. But soon. For real, this time. The kind of soon that came with logistics. Alon read the orders twice. East, he said. Toward the coastal fort. Bertrand looked at the mud under his boots. Can't get wetter than this. Elias didn't speak, but for once, smiled faintly. We began to pack. Slowly. Like men who no longer trusted movement. But it was happening. The camp stirred. Tents folded. Horses saddled. Frogs evacuated. Before I rolled my bedroll, I tucked the book into my satchel. Next to it, I placed the fake map. They didn't belong together. But maybe, in some way, they did. We left Mudspire that afternoon. Not because it was time, but because we'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to say so. The road east felt different. Not easier. Just drier. Mudspire, for all its charm, had soaked into our bones. The sound of boots not squelching was strange, almost suspicious. Alon claimed it was a blessing. Bertrand said it was proof we were in a simulation and nothing was real. No one asked what he meant. We followed a thin, winding path between low hills and dying olive trees. The sun pressed down like an apology that had taken too long to arrive. The sky was too wide. The silence too honest. Every so often, we passed ruins, a broken arch, half a wall, once even the skeleton of a cart with the wheels still spinning faintly in the wind. The kind of place where things used to happen. No bandits. No beasts. Just distance. The captain rode ahead. The bishop followed behind us, seated sideways on a mule that looked like it had once given up and never started again. Bertrand walked beside me, chewing on something he insisted was dried fruit but might have been leather. How far to the fort? I asked. Bertrand shrugged. The map says 2 days. The fake map. It's accurate now. We camped that night on a ridge with just enough room to sleep and just enough rocks to stub every toe. Bertrand set up his tent with the enthusiasm of a man building a monument to future disappointment. Theobald, me, sat beside a small fire and unfolded the blank book. Still empty. Still mine. I wrote, "We're between places. Not where we were. Not yet where we're going. The road feels both old and unfinished. But the quiet is welcome. After Mud Spire, silence feels like a bath." Elias found a small spring nearby. Alon called it sacred. Bertrand dropped his spoon in it and said it tasted like copper. I agreed. In the morning, we walked again. Midway through the day, we smelled the salt. It hit gently at first, a hint of sea air tucked between dust and breeze. Then stronger. Sharper. Alive. The sea, even unseen, demands to be noticed. It crawls into your clothes. Into your throat. Into your memory. Bertrand stopped and sniffed dramatically. Smells like fish ambition. Elias pointed ahead. There. A line on the horizon. White stone. Broken towers. And the sea beyond, glittering like something expensive we'd forgotten we used to want. The coastal fort. We reached it by dusk. It wasn't grand. Not anymore. Most of the upper walls had collapsed. The gates were missing. One corner was scorched black. But it stood. Wind-battered and stubborn. The guard waved us in with the energy of someone who'd been waiting too long to care. Inside, the smell was worse. Fish. Wet wood. Something else. Bertrand suggested seagull politics. We were assigned bunks, actual wooden ones, indoors, with walls that mostly stayed upright. It felt like luxury. I couldn't stop touching the roof. It didn't drip. That night, we sat on the fort's outer wall. The sea stretched out forever. Alon said it made him think of judgment. Bertrand said it made him think of soup. Elias said nothing. Just watched. And me? I opened the book again. Wrote. Today we arrived. Not at the end. Just, somewhere new. The sea is louder than I remember. The wind tastes like iron and nostalgia. The road behind us was long. The road ahead might be longer. But tonight, we rest. And that is enough. I closed the book. Not because the story was over. But because for the first time in days, I didn't feel the need to explain anything. Just Saturday. With wind. And salt. And friends who didn't always make sense, but somehow always made it easier to keep going. We stayed at the coastal fort for 3 days. It was the longest stretch of quiet we'd known since the bishop's chess match. No marching. No mud. No cheese duels. Just wind, the crash of waves, and the slow return of something that felt like peace, or maybe boredom. Sometimes they feel the same. The fort had its own rhythm. Guards moved like ghosts. Supplies came in crates marked wrong. The chapel smelled like fish. Alon called it cleansing. Bertrand called it penance. I just opened the window. Most of our group slept through the first day. On the second, Bertrand tried fishing with his spoon. He caught nothing but the bishop's disapproval. Elias found an old bench and began carving patterns into it. Alon organized the psalm books by how wet they were. I walked the wall and thought. That was new, having time to think without urgency. Without noise. Just the sea and a book that still waited for words. So I wrote. We've traveled far, but the strange part is, I don't know how far. Not in miles. Just in moments. Cheese. Rain. A tower of books. A lizard. A fight with sticks. These things don't measure distance. But they mark it. And I think that counts. Later that evening, Bertrand joined me on the wall. He handed me a small, folded piece of parchment. I wrote something, he said. You wrote? I tried. I opened it. It read. There was a tower. There was a spoon. There were friends. And no one died. Then, also the soup wasn't that bad. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. The next morning, orders arrived again. Fresh ones. Our unit was to be transferred. South. A different region. New terrain. Same war. No one protested. That was how things worked. You moved, or you were moved. Bertrand asked if the new place had fewer frogs. Elias sharpened his stick. Al unpacked in absolute silence. But before we left, I did something. I took the fake map, the one that had led us to nothing and everything, and tacked it to the inside of the fort's empty supply closet. I left the blank book with it. Not all of it. Just a few pages. The rest I folded into my satchel. If someone finds it, maybe they'll read it. Or maybe they'll add their own page. Or maybe they'll burn it for warmth. That's fine too. Because in a war built on names and banners, it felt important that someone, even quietly, remembered the small things. A frog in a tent. A game of chess. A bishop who almost smiled. And us. Just 4 ordinary men who carried more stories than they realized. As we left the fort, I looked back only once. Not because I longed for it, but because I wanted to remember that we had been there. That we had laughed there. That for a short while, we were more than soldiers. We were simply people. And somehow, that was enough.